in other words, taxpayer, government, institutions, that is the large, is absolutely necessary for technology, right? So just like Bill Gates likes to say that it does owe back because he couldn't have done what he did without the transistor radios and beyond.
All
right?
the previous work.
Right. So we kind of, anybody who frankly knows a little bit, and we're all dealing with issues that are highly propagandized and highly toyed into ideology and politics, it's really complicated. I think we agree on more than we disagree, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I do think so. But it's not just the infrastructure. What this book looks into is really, on average, a good 90% and above of all the technology that many of us love, including myself, is really directly coming out of a state entrepreneurship. You know, the public universities, National Science Foundation. Some of them you might, military spin-off. You know, some are, a little more attractive than others.
Even
no doubt.
self-driving cars were part of DARPA.
Right.
If it wasn't for the government.
Right. And of course, now we don't invest in these kind of things, perhaps, or many people argue as much as we did. So, what about developing? Are we going to catch up with quantum, computing fast enough? So I'm concerned with this kind of, the difference between an individualism as part of innovation. I totally feel that what you're saying, that's individualism, part of the Enlightenment, very good, releasing the individual to innovate, to try different strange things that society maybe thinks habitually should be banned. No, let them, who knows, right? And then how do we organize social institutions that foster this kind of behavior? Because after all, entrepreneurs can also be excellent thieves. Recently, we've seen what happens with
that.
Right?
Well,
I know it's a we've been discussing it for 100 years.
When you talk about when you look at the government investment in these things is a holdover, and this goes back to Keynesian theory 90 years ago, was the only institution that had the funds or ability to fund things that may not make money on a long-term scale was the government. Whereas when you look at the technology sector, you look at the way Facebook went public as a dual-class option, you look at the way Google, Amazon, these companies have gone public. They've gone public to allow them to take a long-term perspective on things. And so what my belief is the private sector's access to big data and having cash reserves puts them in a position in this century to make the gut investments that the government did in the last century.
I see it. Of course, traditionally, the answer would be, the knee-jerk response I would have, of course, is, why would they? Right? I mean, nowadays, of course, the return is better to purchase politicians. It's the highest ever recorded in human history, 22,000%.
And one thing to our audience out there, for those of you that try to tune into the Facebook video feed, it's back on.
It's experimental, and Jesse's kind of jumping up and down between DJing and and getting this to work. So cut him some slack.
So it's working now.
It's working now. I see it there, and now I know where the camera. I was like, wait, that guy.
And the MP3s we got down. We could, we'll see. We'll make a video clip. Yeah, thanks.
And of course, our opinions stated here today is totally ours, not of the staff here at WPRK or the nice people at Bronx.
And we intend to express many conflicting and incommensurable opinions at the same time too, because we're complex humans.
You got to be a rebel. You got to cause trouble.
Yeah. Exactly.
The only people that have actually been remembered that way and pushed society forward are the ones that have really challenged the existing rules. And that's, when you say, why would corporations do that? That's the argument that I started in corporate empathy, why I got behind conscious capitalism, and what I'm proposing in Unlocking the Labor Cage is the idea that the same way the government in the 20s and 30s decided to create the big deal was because philosopher, economist John Keynes gave the entities permission to invest or spend tax dollars at that point. And what I'm trying to do is build momentum that there is permission, that with big data, with long-term metrics, that these investments by the private sector can show large returns for society as a larger whole, which when you look at the executives that are kind of the ones that are targets for this, that have that kind of influence, they're ones that are thinking long-term. I mean, Larry and Sergey, when they went public with Google, they didn't go public with a quarterly profit mindset, and they haven't done what they've done having that mindset. So I think there's some leaders out there that can find that once given the proper tools can make use of them.
So, in technology, of course, we do have a relatively, sometimes relatively good employers, no doubt. Certainly, if they're able to escape, in other words, going public puts you under the boot of the, 3-month horizon.
Yes.
And that has been one of the most crippling things for our economy for the past, 20 years at least. But these are long cycles. I must say that I'm always gonna, because how to get them there. Now, one of the people who influenced me most professionally was Deirdre McCloskey, and I wrote a book on it and stuff. And politically, we're very different, which makes it even more interesting. My chief problem, and she's written recently primarily about what the bourgeois ethics, 3 volumes on these issues. She's definitely primarily looking at the history, recognizing how the change of ideas was important also. Than the change of material conditions kind of in the late Enlightenment into the Industrial Revolution, etc. And suggests that that's a place we should look in the crisis. So I definitely hear echoes of what you're saying here, absolutely. The problem is a little bit, and this is Punkonomics, so we go all over the place. How do we get it to happen? I can see, how is this not a utopia? Or at least a bygone era also, where the entrepreneurs in the late 18th century, early 19th century would reinvest everything. Sure, they would exploit their workers, but the exploitation that they reaped from it did not go out offshore right away or into luxuries, reinvested. And that's kind of the core of accumulating capital. That's what makes capitalism work. Nothing's perfect, but in so much as they did a pretty good job in the past 250 years.
And it's, I look at, Andrew Carnegie as an example, and the worker issues that he had. When you look at the challenges we have socially today, Andrew Carnegie was born when this country still allowed people to be owned as slaves. So when you look at how far we still have to go today, it's he was the first generation of American white males that had to look at people no longer as property. And then you look at the difference when you look at Henry Ford, who now looked at his workers as potential consumers, because he was born after Carnegie. And then, so then I'll skip forward to more recently. Steve Jobs, when he went public, and he's got his own issues with handling people and personalities. But what he did, well, don't we all? But he hired a CEO when they went public, and it bit him, and he ended up getting ousted from his own company. And I believe when you look at the way Google went the way Google went public with dual class, combined with the lessons learned with Jobs, is why Mark Zuckerberg went dual class when they went public, and he hired a COO instead of a CEO. Because there were times when Sheryl Sandberg when they went public, there were people in Wall Street that said, she's the one with more experience, she should be the CEO, and he should step aside. And I believe he learned a lesson from Jobs' experience about stepping aside for a CEO. And so the next step of that is, you're looking at the C-suite here, and the CFO. The CFOs that are currently at that top level were educated in the Chicago School of Economic Theory that you keep a certain amount of reserves, you look at the numbers, you don't look at the long term. And I think when I look at what's happening at colleges such as Rollins and other schools, the business schools are starting to teach financial management that looks more long-term, more sustainably, and more holistically. So
going back to the 1930s, essentially. I just think
exactly. So,
back in the day where economists were actually ahead of the curve.
Yes, and then they got lost after World War II. You didn't experiment the same way.
Right. So going
back that changes. The CFO position needs to adapt the same way the CEO and COO position have changed. With my example is Facebook. Is the CFO really needs to get in there and go, we can change the dynamic of the way we circulate currency, and instead of sitting on it where it's being wasted, we can large scale invest and look at long term. What does it do long term for the stability of the company and growth of the company?
So you're basically, you're talking on. So you're bringing in the most important topic of all in economics, power. And here you're talking about an issue that a couple of months ago, end of the semester, I think, lassoed, and I'll do it again, with your colleague Avi Baranes, to talk about institutional economics and precisely these kind of issues very much in line with this problem of who controls the company. In this case, we're only talking among quote-unquote capitalists. Really, it's time to put that term in quotes, I think. In other words, people who own parts of companies. So a minority of influential people. So will it be the general investors and financiers that call the shots because company is a little more than stocks? Or will it be the managers of the companies? Often people, Steve Jobs, great example, or Zuckerberg in this case, people who actually created their product, so they care often more. And this is used, in the good old days we had more of this indeed, and part of our problems is this part of the financialization. So absolutely true. But I want to throw a bomb out there. Facebook is a problem politically. Isn't their basic model? I don't want them to succeed. Isn't their basic model spying? And here I am trying to stream on the and I have an account. I know. I don't put Messenger on my phone though anymore. Never. Sorry.
No, I know.
I'm done with it.
I could let you know I was in traffic.
Well, there you go.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, you're wearing a T-shirt that basically
It's very cool.
says it right there.
Thanks.
If corporations are people, shouldn't they act like adults? And that's so true.
But some adults are rapists and child molesters and
Yes.
stuff,
Of course,
right?
and that's what we are seeing with corporations today. I'm studying human resources right now, and I'm trying to get into the corporate mindset. I mean, I did work for a corporation a long time ago, so I know there's a complete different mindset and a different set of views that almost clash with the working force. I mean, and no matter how you look at it, if you want to look at it from a humanistic side, at the end of the day, it's just numbers.
And that's how our current corporate structure had looked at it, and that came down to the social responsibility of a company is to its shareholders, and this idea. But the idea is it came out of academia that it was about the numbers, and it worked with globalization because everything was growing at a time that we could hide the flaws in the system. And so when you look at it now, I look at the same self-improvement that people took for themselves professionally in the late 80s, 90s, early aughts, is what now you see capitalism and corporations doing for themselves. I think when you look at the B Corporation movement, or Branson's B Team, or conscious capitalism, or the triple bottom line, it's now how do corporations, as these public people entities, reflect on themselves and do a better job.
Why would they? Again, I'm being devil's advocate here. Why would they if they're not forced to?
Well, my core belief, the quick answer on that, is the ones that don't will lose to the ones that do. Because in the end, even a shareholder is a customer. And Professor Lynn Stout, she's at Cornell, wrote a book called The Shareholder Value Myth. And it's this, you could talk to law graduates, any number of people that will claim that it is the legal responsibility of a corporation to its shareholders. But that's built, what her argument is, that argument is built on a fiction. When you look at the BP oil spill, which shareholder were they maximizing profits for when they cut corners? The middle class person that had a retirement home along the coast of Florida, or the hedge fund manager that was overly focused on the performance of the stock? And so just by that design alone, maximizing profits for the shareholder is not the smart long-term move, even for the shareholder. And so this is the thing that but it's become this mythological fact, and it's not a fact. It's based in myth. It's based in practice. And how do you change the practice? But
it's a useful myth.
It is a useful myth for those that want to follow
willing to
it.
play this game. A warlord essentially, mentality in economics.
But the argument I'm making here, and what she's making, is stop believing in the myth, and it gives you incentives for doing it a better way, and then competition, I believe, takes over, and the companies that do better will outperform the ones that are still short-sighted.
But, well, let's go back to Facebook. I mean, isn't basically their bottom line business model collect as much information, create the biggest data set possible, thus know the population of the planet better than they know themselves, and thus have power over them? That is why I said I'm not sure I want them to succeed. Google are not cool with a lot of things. There's issues. I'd like to re-paraphrase Karl Marx about this. That Marx pointed out they're valid and everybody learned that lesson from him, whatever their politics, what matters the most is the means of production. You know, who owns them, who gets the benefit of their output, the means of production. Today I like to paraphrase, and it's mine, that these are the means of reproduction in the digital society. Right? So who controls the means of reproduction, precisely? So why is YouTube so valuable? Because of all the amazing cat videos that people, I mean, I'm joking, of course, all the content that was put for free by individuals, right? But who actually owns them? Google does. And so Google kind of, but at the same time they provide all these amazing things. So on the average, sure, but are they evil? We're all evil. They try not to. They're certainly not embracing it. I'm concerned that Facebook is a little bit. In fact, here's a wonderful example. I'm going to monopoly power. I'm going to Adam. I quoted, I didn't quote it, I paraphrased Marx, but then I'll go to Adam Smith in a second. You know, the role of government is to limit monopoly power, or any kind of power in the society, to allow for competition. That's like the shortest I know. Sorry, Adam Smith scholars and such, right? So he's basically accepting the fact that you do have some kind of elected or some kind of governmental body keeping companies from becoming too powerful. And the reason why I don't quit Facebook, especially after the fact that they torpedoed all the second market apps that were rewrapping Facebook in a mode that doesn't eat all your memory and opens all your information to Facebook, you know, and they nuked it. They nuked it on purpose. And like 2 months ago, they started nuking it, and they started even on, you know, only on a desktop computer can you really get Messenger without the app. There's some workarounds, but no, and. Yeah, I don't have control of my stuff. I paid for it once, and then I don't even own it. I mean, I can, you know, again, I'm the biggest client Amazon, probably one of the biggest clients Amazon ever had, at least for a middle class guy, right? But I know that all the thousands of books, I don't even own them. I lease them.
You lease them.
So why? There is no other Amazon out there offering me. With us, you get to buy the book. Only piracy actually gives me a good liberal market, you know, liberal. I don't mean in America, right? In the free market, in free market, right? The traditional market.
Liberal as in a lot of choice.
So bottom line for all my rambling is, how do we get past the situation that, due to all these things you mentioned and others surely, we've gotten to where we are today, where we have way too much concentrated power, and therefore we have no democracy, we have no competition, we have little innovation, etc., etc. How do we get past that into some kind of ideal where capitalists become more conscious, one way or another?
And there's more competition and more distribution of ideas. And that's where, you know, the ideas, again, you harken back to Marx and Smith, that it was about the means of production. And what I'm arguing is, like Keynes predicted in 1930, we would move beyond looking at the means of production. The economic possibilities of our grandchildren was his essay in 1930, that eventually we would solve the economic problem, and we would have to transition to something else. He didn't know what that was and couldn't predict it. But what I'm proposing is we're reaching that limit. And so now the means of production need to be expanded, or can be expanded, to evaluate, quantify, and compensate, and therefore circulate currency based on any and all value creation, as opposed to just the production of goods and services. And that's the core of the thesis. Is we have currently, as a capitalist, there's only 3 methods to circulate.
I was just going to ask you to
yes.
because I read that piece of your.
Okay.
Please.
There are currently only 3 methods to circulate currency. The primary method, the one we're discussing the most here, is the free market, the exchange of capital for goods, services, information, all the things that the free market allows for. The second way is the involuntary acquisition of capital from companies through taxes and individuals through the government for distribution through social services and government services. The third and currently final way of circulating currency is the donation of excess profits into philanthropic and charitable causes and that route. There's the only 3 ways to get currency into the market. And what I'm proposing in Unlocking the Labor Cage is that a fourth way of voluntarily circulating currency is needed, and that in an age of big data and user-generated content having all of this value, that the way to circulate currency is based on how do you generate more user-generated content and better quality user-generated content in the long-term cycle. And so that's why the acute portion of my thesis is the investment in undergraduate fellowships, because the economic trajectory we're on with student loans and education costs is at a crisis level at this point. And the nice thing about the education system, while there are a lot of problems, it is a peer-reviewed, merit-based system. So it fits with capitalism mindset, quote unquote, of it being merit-based.
It's a pretty picture, I gotta say, a little.
That is a pretty picture, but that's the nice thing is this doesn't.
It's somewhat idealistic. I'm saying
sure.
to the real world, it's like.
There's an idealism in it.
No.
However, it doesn't.
No, for education specifically.
For education, yeah.
No, you put us a little bit on a higher pedestal than we deserve. I think it's Noam Chomsky that jokes about how, why do academics look so good in history? Because we write the books.
We write the books. And I have to say, I've spent 4 years at a private university now with the University of Tampa, and exploring, I've been out here a few times, I'm getting to learn a lot, and there are a lot of flaws in the academic system. However, I read a friend's dissertation last year on free will skepticism, and when I looked at it, I looked at dissertations, and you look at how they never reach the public eye. And I look at it now, this is my programming background, there is a lot of academic data that right now is sitting in raw material form.
Amen to that.
That if I handed you the code for Facebook, you can do nothing with it without the interface. And what I think needs to happen for academia is a blending between the private sector and academic institutions. Really, if you look at Stanford put an experiment out there called Open Loop. The idea that instead of 4 years at the beginning of your life, you would cycle through 6 years of college anytime you felt the need that it would sharpen your skills or your thought process.
Right, I mean, because there's another whole topic that maybe we'll dedicate, I don't know, we'll see how it goes, but actually the use of technology in education is my primary concern for over 10 years now. So I hear you loud and clear. Of course, sadly, again, I would say, most of what we talk about school reforms today, and especially the ones that are well-financed and have a profile, a public profile, are little more than rackets again.
Yeah.
But that's so often the case, right? I mean, just because you hear a lot of noise and things that literally you're right to see are even malicious.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that you have to throw the entire idea out. In fact, particularly when at times of change, it's difficult to establish what's the good idea exactly.
Yeah, and I think the peer-reviewed, the core of what a university is supposed to be is still absolutely good. But when you look at the marketing material of any university, they will tout their capital expenditures, but they don't tout how much debt they're responsible for. And I think that's something that needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, I read recently also how again a big number here, right, with all the caveats, mathematically and statistically speaking, but all the top Ivy Leagues, the real Ivy Leagues, which of course there's so many other top schools that are just as good, but the famous Ivy Leagues, about only a third of their freshman seats are even open to the public.
Yeah,
and all the rest is legacy. So you got in because of other reasons, not because of any meritocracy of any kind. So as in the old Jewish saying I love so much, my dad told me, the fish stinks from the head. Usually when you see a problem, guess where the source is? At the top. And indeed, I see the ideals of the education system that were actually maintained, getting better over the years, not perfect, nothing is, have also suffered from problems.
Yeah.
So maybe the education system got contaminated by similar things than the business community got contaminated by.
Well, it has. I mean, when you look at it, the same idea of using adjuncts instead of faculty is the same concept as getting rid of middle management and using outsourced labor.
Right.
I mean, the academic institutions are following the business example of the businesses they pushed MBAs out into over the 70s and 80s.
It's very difficult to measure, which is one of the big problems. So the academia suffers particularly from the problem expressed best by the old joke that, you know, you meet the drunk looking for his keys under a lamppost at night. And
Why are
ask
you
him,
looking
why
here?
are you looking here? I lost my key. Want to help me? Where'd you drop them? I dropped them back in the dark alleys. Why are you looking here? Well, because there's light.
Yes.
So, horrible measurement. We don't really know how to measure. We're by the seat of our pants, and then we tell the kids to do their homework.
And then you know, the funding structure is because of the federal loan guarantees. There's no, you know, when you ask of why you know, why would an executive or private company start investing in education? There's no reason the current system's not going to stop doing it the way they're doing it when it comes to academic institutions and changing that percentage of faculty to adjuncts and lowering the cost of tuition. And there's no source of money right now for any of that.
Yeah. And the private schooling is, a racket is way too polite
Yes.
a word to describe their operating. And they've also actually influenced. It's one of the things that we learn in institutional economics and the neoclassical Chicago school completely forgot. That when you have a growing, even a minority of an industry that's building this new, highly exploitative and highly profitable model, then before you know it, the well-meaning, old, very quickly, in fact, shockingly quickly, the traditional established institutions follow suit.
Yeah.
And, you know, and become not much better.
No.
Or at least move towards that direction. So there's a lot of flux going on here too. That's not that echoes interestingly to the general economy, because we're not isolated. It's one of the difficulties.
No, and that's, you know, with globalization, you know, we can say we outsource jobs, but in other places, those jobs are providing opportunities.
Yeah.
You know, and again, that trajectory that if we're a global society and we're looking at all of it, how does the whole planet do better? You know, not just one or the other. And I think that's when you look at the political, you know, spectrum right now. It's all focused on how does the country do better.
Yeah.
Would you agree that technology has just come to us way too quickly? I mean, for globalization?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely spaces where it's too quick and we're not adapting quickly. But, you know, how many people put off anything until the very last minute? So it could take an extra 50 years to get where we're at right now, and we'd probably still wait till the last minute to fix it. So, you know, both of those, I think.
Yeah, but not very little. I mean, there might be specific places, like for example, specifically a place where slowing down seems to be a very interesting idea is in financial transactions. So it's not saying that sometimes things don't have to be specifically looked at and dealt with. Again, we have the issue of who will deal with it. You know, given the kind of money you make out of these fraction of a second transaction at mass speed, merely based on the fact that you have the biggest network is what making you make the money off of thousands of a cent. Who's going to stop it, right? Given that they buy the politician, they own the proper committees, and they finance the candidates. So we have that. To me, it's just such a pressing matter, because if we are to save capitalism, and it might be a better path than abandoning all hope.
Yes.
I think.
Thanks.
Me too.
I don't want to abandon all hope.
I hear ya.
That's a challenging proposition.
That seems to be the real stumbling stone, you know,
The
getting out
finance-
of that concentrated power.
No, that. Oh, go ahead.
No, the one thing we've been talking about in human resources that also affects everything else, particularly in technology, is the fact that, you know, we have a couple different generations now. The baby boomers, I mean, some of us are keeping up with technology, or barely, you know, and then you have the millennials. And the two separate and different cultures of the way they interface with technology and society. Millennials tend to be a little bit more connected electronically versus in the reality world like we are.
Yeah.
You know, the baby boomers still
Speak for yourself.
they still want to you know, reach out and touch somebody, whereas millennial wants to send an email, you know, or a text message.
Block.
Exactly. Pong.
That's what I was like most excited about VR. You know, you can block people in the real world.
Right, but what we're noticing is that the millennials are replacing the baby boomers now. I mean, obviously, either because of age or because technology has facilitated in a way that the baby boomers have had to catch up one way or another. It's either that or die.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so what we're seeing is that in the future we're going to need so much manpower. that's where outsourcing may help. Not now. I mean, right now it's killing the middle class. So again, what I'm saying is that technology, we're absorbing technology at a much slower pace than when it's coming out. It's a complete negative. I mean, it's not natural. At least the progression is.
Well, it's a cycle. I gotta say, I mean, it's kind of a major shtick for me. So then I'll let you, see what you have to say. That's why we talk about it sometimes. This is bigger than transition to 19th century. Very important era of the Industrial Revolution. In some sense, this is more like the late 17th century, the beginning of the Enlightenment. Why? Precisely because this is real change, what you're describing here. Technological change is not a new gadget. It's when the technology literally changes two general aspects. One, more commonly understood, social relations, like where do you go to work? You work on your farm, now you go to work in the factory, stuff like that. Now you lose your job because it's all offshore, that sort of thing. And the second thing that is maybe more strange for us, because more divorced from us, is this view of the human existence. The general, what does it mean to be human? What is my role in society? These very deep questions. So we're more a little bit like late 17th century, where people don't know what the hell is going on in this world. This is a completely new territory in many ways. So yeah, the kids are maybe schizophrenia is normal now. There's a whole lot of development, and many of them are scary. Many of them will cause serious troubles, but maybe are unavoidable. Well, you're talking about the next one, maybe. The real scary one, again, is the end of the work. And what do we do about it?
And that's the challenge that, you're right, the 17th century. That was, all of a sudden we went from a feudalistic society where most people were serfs, peasants, or slaves, and didn't, forget about self-actualization. It was survival, and that was it. And, your kings and landlords had all the power. And then in the industrial age, you've got a little bit, society's raised up a little bit, but now power's concentrated amongst, governments and corporations and the capitalists. And the counterbalance to that was the worker. And so you've had this conflict between worker and capital since Smith, Marx, and to today. And what this next transition, though, is while the worker is still going to be, there's still people that are going to have to do work and produce things in society at different levels, and that'll change over time. We need another way to value human creation. And that's what's missing politically, economically, and in the system right now, is there's no method of doing that. When you look at, go back to YouTube videos, if you get a certain number of views on YouTube, YouTube knows the value of the user-generated content, and they will compensate you as a producer. But they can't compensate everybody. And this is actually when we spoke, when I heard you guys a year ago when I was here, the conversation was about micropayments or universal basic income. And I don't see either of those as potential options, because micropayments will change the nature of user-generated content, and a universal basic income doesn't account for the fact, well, what if all of a sudden food becomes free because companies decide it's more profitable to give food away and make more money on things that have higher margins? So a universal basic income doesn't fix the problem of how do you compensate value creation. And so that's kind of what I'm exploring, is how do we look at that compensate, or how do we compensate that, but remove the potential for tainting the user-generated content. Obviously, if you're a producer on YouTube, you're producing content specifically to make an income from. But if you're just the general population uploading your videos, you're contributing to the value of that company.
Right.
What good is it doing the world or you for doing that? And there's no, you can't, like I said, you can't directly compensate for those general things, but you can give the company economic permission to value that creation and circulate currency in other ways that company sees fit.
I tell you, this is really what I really bit on this. So to do this, in some sense, seems to me, you're talking about a new theory of value. As an economist, I'm like, ooh.
Yes.
Wow. This is a really big deal. I mean, every economist immediately pricks his ears, right? Because And the other people obviously like roll their eyes, and they're probably right that it is important, right? Because we're talking about, if anything, this is the great transformation of the field. The notion that from labor theory of value, that Smith and Marx was the last one, I guess, the last big economist that used it, right? Something is worth something for the effort put into it, the value of the effort put into it. It switched then maybe too much. I mean, I think completely to the value of something is how much you can squeeze people to pay for it, essentially. Right? Next step was, of course, putting labor. It's a special market. Essentially, right, in Chicago par excellence, you like completely ignore whatever you think, just like, no, you're not allowed. It's against the religious dogma to even articulate that there could be a market that's fundamentally different, philosophically speaking, like the market for bubblegum or the market for people. The labor market. We have a labor market. We call it free labor, sure, it's certainly an improvement, but it's not entirely free. Right? You don't get to renegotiate by yourself so much unless you're at the very upper echelons. Similarly, here I'm thinking of the creators on the internet. They get paid. How are you valuing their contribution when, I mean, essentially they are offering it for free or close to for free? And then the value is for whom, right? How do they get paid? It becomes an important element based on who owns it. I mean, it's a very tall order. Do you see a way? You know, talk more about the way to kind of put maybe a foot in the door a little bit here, because I think this idea implies one way broader than that. And we will be at the top of the hour, which will be a perfect time for you to kind of get into more how to operationalize this. Because could it not be even useful for let's say environmental problems, right? I mean, one of the major problems we're not valuing. Just like we're not valuing the, you know, I don't know what Jenna Marbles put on YouTube properly or sufficiently well. We're not valuing the service to the environment, and here we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars a year. Yeah. And maybe the only way a capitalist system could actually deal with those issues, right? To go back to what you were saying, we can't just wait, Chicago school style, wait for a miracle to happen, somebody figure it out for us, right? No, not until we value it. Would even a market, straight up market economist see it as valid argument. So yeah, let's look at this issue of how to value things. It's the core issue of economics.
Yep. And we'll be right back with some more Punkonomics after a couple public service announcements. You are listening to WPRK, Winter Park, Florida, the best in basement radio.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, yeah, you see what I'm saying? It's the issue of valuing stuff holistically.
It's big, yeah, and that's things. I think we have the data's there now. You know, when you look at Simon Kuznets, GNP, he said when he created it, it's not a good measure of well-being. Robert Kennedy, his speech about GDP, it's not a good measure, but we've become tied to it. You know, and I don't see, you know, what if we created a, you know, user-generated content index that was used to value that?
There are interesting indices out there precisely to measure things much better than GDP, obviously. But I mean, I can't help I'm not being conspiracy theorist, but in some sense, I mean, these tools are so useful. Look, what do we report? The health of the economy, GDP and Dow Jones. Yeah. I tell my students, you know, nobody uses Dow Jones in a statistical regression for decades already. If anybody uses, it's just a really bad index.
Yeah.
People use S&P 500 when they do statistics at undergraduate level.
Yeah.
So why? What is this? Stupidity? There's a limit to how much you can. You know, when we had a paper in the 90s, all the mergers and acquisitions destroyed investor value. Never mind the workers.
Oh yeah.
Why do we let them go through the courts? So that it's a very useful myth for those who carry power. So I have this issue. I mean, my radicalness is a little bit in that you can't go around. That's where I go back to somewhat traditional West, maybe.
Yeah.
How do you get
You've got to get through.
over that? You know.
You've got to get through.
How do you break the bank? I mean, then we can if you like, or not. You know, you can steer. You can go even political. I argue that.
I have that. I mean,
post ideology, please. You know.
Yeah. Well, that's like I said. That's where I'm starting to look into. Is the next step with this is the research. What other, you know, I'm proposing investment in education, but what other dominoes fall?
How do you get there? How do you force them to? How do you make it?
You don't force them. One company does it. and it changes.
Just through marketing then and PR?
No, what I mean is if one tech company were to make an investment like I suggested, the entire dynamic of Silicon Valley and world finance changes.
Because of the first leader effect?
Yeah,
kind of, where
like
they
the idea.
become-
So, Google.
Why is it so good for them? Why does it give them an advantage?
Well, it would give them a first mover advantage. If Google repatriated 1% of its cash overseas and invested it in education, it wouldn't be taxed for that investment because the government would still be looking at it as a philanthropic contribution. So technically, they could pull $1 billion over, invest it in education, tax-free, to see what happens. So a 4-year example wouldn't cost anything. But what would that do to the student loan bubble? What would that do to faculty? All those kind of things. And that's the next step I see is investigating, finding a partner, somebody to do that, but then investigating the ramifications of changing circulation.
And how do you, again, this is very, how do you bring to bear the accountability? Here I am, I'm pretending I'm a CFO of Google, or many they have, I don't even know, right? Alphabet. Say, let's invest in fleet.
All right, welcome back to Punkonomics.
Do what?
Let's invest in Alex.
Yeah.
The returns, man. Oh, yeah. We, of course, as usual, we kind of started to chat. So let's try and recoup here. So, I'm pushing really about how to make it happen. I mean, I can see, if we could get, this is where I'm the skeptic a little bit, right? If we could get corporations to behave as adults with a civic sense, kind of the welfare of all humanity, that will be in heaven, right?
Absolutely.
That's not in the real world. That's right. How do you get there? How do you push that foot in the door? How do we even start the trend of moving towards a responsible?
The first is giving them permission, and that's what this theory proposes, that you have permission to do what you want with your capital, and that value creation is important. The metrics of trying it are really finding even one large technology company that were to stumble on this and say, hey, we like the idea, we want to try it. Repatriation of capital from overseas invested into a private college institution, nonprofit like Rollins or similar types of schools, would be seen by the government as a philanthropic contribution still. So it would be a tax-free investment. So technically, any company could try this for 4 years to get through a cycle of a fellowship and not have an actual hit to capital or taxes or any other down negative effect to the company's bottom line if they were looking at it as a short-term experiment. What I believe is once one company were to try that, the other dominoes that fall, the schools potentially being, not pressure on their studies, but pressure on the quality of the studies. Again, the number of adjuncts or full-time staff at a university. So those things, what would those change? What would the marketing and public relations bump be for the company that did that? If you look at Starbucks in 2014, they got a large public relations pop and boom because Howard Schultz decided they needed to invest in their baristas, and now you can get a college degree while you're working at Starbucks, and when you're done, you can walk away and you don't owe Starbucks and you can study anything you want. Now, it's not ideal, but it's definitely something that hadn't been done before, and I think something, but I saw it as a step. It was 100 years after Henry Ford invested $5 a day in his workers, and that wasn't a perfect system by any means, but it opened the door for a middle class to form. I think Schultz's step in 2014, I was in the middle of writing this, and that's when I was like, wow, somebody already sort of did what I meant. They have to be an employee of the company, but it still was unprecedented that you could go to school for anything you wanted to. They saw value in that. The idea being, what's the recoup on that investment is better user-generated content is going to come from a better, more rounded population, which would increase the long-term benefit to the companies that do it. But again, it can't be that kind of tit-for-tat investment. It has to be more similar to Andrew Carnegie with the Gospel of Wealth and the Giving Pledge, that a lot of CEOs have done now. Those have been personal pledges. But now the idea is Andrew Carnegie invested in libraries because he got his foothold because of a library he was given access to.
Might be a lot of ego involved, by the way, but again, if your ego
There's
builds
ego
a whole bunch
everywhere.
of museums, you know, it's
Yes.
might be a better application of your ego, no doubt. You know, again, I find this fascinating, though I'm a skeptical listener. Again, because of the how to get past. Here's an example. I must say that a lot of these contritions among the upper classes, I think, are a lot to do with feeling a little bit that they overextended themselves and feeling the hate that the majority of the population of the planet feels towards them. Of course, it's potentially unfair because there is a small maybe not a minority, maybe a majority even, though certainly not a majority in terms of influence, who were decent human beings. But they were egregious violations again and again. So I think there is a bit of a kind of, let's kind of cover this, let's look good because everybody hates us going on. But again, perhaps that is the key. Perhaps, you know, the fact that they need to worry a little bit. They need to worry about their, like, as the Carnegie generation, they could have been first-rate douches, I believe I can say that.
Yeah.
But personally, but they ended up doing perhaps more good than bad overall. How do we get there today is the key issue, where I see a lot, given the sophistication of marketing, especially, and vast propaganda. Here, the case that a student taught me years ago, Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola got into the whole social entrepreneurship thing, they were heralded everywhere, in schools too, and a lot of places like that. And my student was totally in that, and then she wrote a paper with me, and I asked, okay, now let's dig up the dirt now. Enough of the good stuff, you know, because that's what I call balance, right?
Sure.
And she did an amazingly brilliant job of it, and saw the situation where you poison the water of 100,000 people, most notably birth defect and pregnant women in India, and then you build an orphanage for those kids, and you bring the media to take pictures. So you killed 100,000 and you saved 12. And
that's a true humanitarian.
there's
right?
so much of this stuff, the charity industrial complex as the so again, is charity a bad thing? Of course it isn't. Is it enough? Of course it isn't. So it's a bit of a very easy to slip into this turning into, even back in the good old days of capitalism, there was air quotations. This was, and I think that's why your ideas are so interesting, and that's why I brought up Igor Miklowski. How do you get this feudal, perhaps, the lords? True that nobody owned anything and had very little freedom. It was society-based, but the lords didn't have freedom either. Nobody had freedom. Even the king didn't have freedom, because until late in the 17th century, when the king becomes for the first time like a monarch under God. It was monarch so long as the dukes don't assassinate me tomorrow was the model for thousands of years. I mean, over 1,000 years. So in fact, the feudal elites felt, by rule of the system, their faith, everything, an obligation, right, to pay back to society. Sure, I get more of the crops, I take more of the peasants, though some scholars argue that perhaps actually, at least in Western Europe, feudalism was a bit better than we tend to think about it. In terms of certainly standard of living, it was after the Industrial Revolution that we caught back with the high medieval times in terms of food and health and such. So how do we avoid, how do we instill such a feeling? It seems like such a cultural revolution. I mean, I know I'm asking you the impossibly difficult question that people have been trying to negotiate for millennia before capitalism was even invented. So I know, but even practically here, how do we get Google to repatriate some of the taxes that it's trying to avoid paying, like everybody else, and invest it in schools? And how do we make sure they don't invest it in some kind of cockamamie school scheme, as so many are out there?
Like Trump University?
How do we impose the social good? How do we even determine? Of course, it's difficult, but even in more pragmatic things like, we need to stop the outsourcing of certainly quality jobs, because like as you put out, it's no longer miners.
No.
Now where it's computer programmers, it's they're replaced by cheaper labor and eventually by machines. So yeah, I know. How do you even start that? I mean, how do you convince them to try that out? They have enough cash.
Well, that I think there's when you look at that 1% or the ultra rich, there's two different types, and I think when you look at the ones leading this giving pledge and philanthropic side, they're not the institutional family wealthy. They are the, when you look at whether it was Carnegie 100 years ago, or it's Zuckerberg and Google and the founders there that are doing these things, they're a different mentality than the institutional wealth that is traditionally using the government to protect its own wealth. And the idea there's, I really look at, when you look at a society, I don't expect that institutional wealth to change the system any more than I would expect somebody in abject poverty to change the system. The bubble is too enclosed for those people. But when you look at Mark Zuckerberg or Andrew Carnegie or Henry Ford, those are the people that have been on both sides. And I think those people do see it a little bit differently. Are they still, Mark, like I said, with Facebook, he made a great hire with Sheryl Sandberg as a COO. But as the CFO, they didn't make any changes there. And again, I think that next step in the C-suite is revamping the financial office and revamping that financial office to look at a broader picture. And I think that then, and again, the same way the management of companies came out of one school of thinking in academia in the 60s and 70s, this new school of thinking will get into those upper management things. Now the question is when? Does it happen sooner, like I'm hoping, with a company that says, hey, we can fix a lot of problems by circulating currency a different way, or is it going to wait for more idealistic millennials to get higher up the ladder in their careers? And when you mentioned generational side of it, I was talking to a friend of mine, Chuck Underwood. He studies generational leadership, and he has a PBS documentary now called Boomers Up, No Excuses. And he actually says boomers are not retiring right now.
They can't.
At certain levels, the leaders of our country that are boomers are inheriting a corrupt system that was actually handed off to them by the silent generation.
Right.
That what it was the GI generation did these great things in the 50s and 60s. And then it was the silent generation that in the 70s and 80s did the same thing without broadening their spectrum because that's how they were raised as children. And now it's actually the boomers who caused wide revolutions in the 60s when they had no money and influence, are now those same boomers are the ones that are involved with conscious capitalism, benefit corporations, and all these more progressive ways of looking business holistically. So now you've got a boomer generation in the latter part of their career looking at legacy, ego, but also looking at how do we start fixing some of these things because they're not working. And so I think there's a lot of incentive in the boomer generation as they have this expansive leadership ability in them to take responsibility. Anyway,
right. It's a do or die type situation for a lot of us boomers.
Yes.
We're facing, in retrospect, a lot more, or I should say, different types of conditions. Whether it's in the working environment or just living environment, the costs, transportation, communications, everything has changed so much, and most of us that are still working, because there is a huge part of the boomers that also have retired, and they are coming back too because they're not making really any money to keep living. So a lot of us are returning back to academia to face large loans. Okay, a lot of us are using our 401ks to be able to subsidize that because of the mentality of trying to save. Because Uncle Sam is charging a big interest, so you go to a bank, you get something a little bit on the lower side, and you deal with it. But then when you come out, technology has evolved so fast that whatever it is that you studied, whatever degree that you got, it's almost obsolete.
Well, that's, education wasn't intended for that at this level. When you look at how many boomers went to school in the 60s and 70s and don't use their degree, college was a test period to get you from childhood to adulthood. It wasn't meant to pay for itself.
Right.
And again, that's a problem when you look at ourselves being older going back. But then when you look at 18-year-olds coming out of high school, we're asking high school graduates to solve a problem that we created, we're denying, and have no clue how to fix.
Right.
That's not an
Right.
18-year-old's
And
responsibility.
then spit on them
That's
and call
ours.
them privileged, entitled.
Exactly.
Right.
After
Why
we
would you
trash the
study
planet.
that?
Yeah.
And that's just wrong.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, it's very important. I mean, that's again, a fundamental change. We haven't fundamentally changed our education system since the mid to late 19th century. I'm not talking about the details. I'm talking about the fundamental pedagogical philosophy, right? Of how does one teach?
Yeah.
How do you know if you learned? The deep stuff. And it's difficult, of course. And there's all these, gimmicks coming out, and it's hard
I
to
hear a
separate.
phone in the background. Is
It's not mine.
this phone?
It's that one.
Oh, okay.
Oh, God, poor Jesse now has to juggle a third device, but he's good. So that's another example. I mean, what you're describing here, I can
That would
totally
be
see
okay.
this whole promising that schools will actually provide at an undergraduate level a career training for you is just a lie. Even more, we don't even know what the future will be 10 years from now. How can they train you for a job 10 years from now?
But liberal arts
the booth.
is going to be useful no matter what.
Right.
So let me quickly about the generational side. I was watching, and this is Chuck's idea on the silent generation and the damage they've done.
I can't help you right now. We're on the air.
When you look at that,
I'm sorry.
Noam Chomsky,
Okay. Bye.
he's good at identifying the problems in society, but he's not good at coming up with solutions. The same way when you look at the exploitative people in his generation, because he is born in 1928, he's a silent generation. He was taught to do a certain thing, stay within the lines. And whether you're exploitative silent generation or you're a progressive Noam Chomsky silent generation, you're great at identifying what's working for you or what's not working for you, but you're not good at changing it. The difference with this leadership level is, as a boomer, the boomer generation knows when it's not happy and things aren't right and does something about it,
Right.
regardless of the challenges. And I think that's what Chuck's idea with this is that the boomer generation has a big fight, and that there's negatives and positives in it in the way they've run capitalism, but now they're getting a seat at the table as the silent generation dies off and goes into a final retirement.
And when you refer
To
to
take
the
over.
silent generation, you're referring to the Beaver Cleaver.
Yes.
Okay.
The ones that were raised, they
The
were
white-
also called the lucky generation.
Right, the ones that believed in the white picket fence and
Yes.
yeah.
Too young to
Okay.
get drafted to World War II, so
And
that's
too,
lucky that one.
and too old to go to Vietnam.
And too old to go to Vietnam. That's
Yet,
pretty lucky.
yet
no doubt.
they're veterans that went to war, and so they served, or they were raised. They were raised during the Depression, but
Right.
that's with quotes, because actually they turned 9 years old or
Right.
8 or 9 years old when the Depression ended because of World War II.
Right.
Though
Did
it
they-
marks you. I mean, of course,
it marks.
if you learn, if you've ever, I haven't, but I know people who have experienced hunger.
Yeah.
You don't have to experience a few times you're marked.
Yeah.
I
So
tell you
they're
what,
very
in defense of this, and maybe I'm messing with the generations, but of course they're so arbitrary, right? I think I'm like first year X or something myself. So.
On which side? First,
On this
not last.
X side, I'm
I
not
actually-
baby boomer. Yeah. Punk generation.
I call us the variable. We lean either way.
But seeing the maybe cynical, no doubt, but the silent generation, that's the generation that pushed FDR to save this country moderately and stably. One of the things I like to call it my strong defense of Obama. Usually I criticize him, mostly from the left. My strong defense of Obama, that maybe he wanted to make change, but everybody went home once he got elected, right? Nobody was in the streets complaining that he wasn't stopping the war, but in fact escalating them. Nobody was in the street complaining that he's not, redistributing, whatever. So FDR had in the 30s, there were like 30% of Americans were like red flag waving socialists, right? And there was another very strong, also like hard right fascist, like sympathizing with the Nazis. So there was some.
The silent generation were teenagers back then.
Okay,
they
so that's
weren't
kind
in
of
any
before,
sort of
right?
power
So you,
position,
yeah.
and the GI generation wasn't influential at that point.
Mm.
And actually, there's no study on generational leadership prior to the GI generation. That's when this
That's
was
interesting.
when he was. I first met Chuck about 4 years ago. He talked about the 5 generations of leadership that were 5 generations alive. You had millennial, Xers, Boomers, Silent, and GI generation. And actually, anybody born that's under the age of 20 isn't part of a generation yet. We might call them digital. There's a bunch of people coming up with things, but we don't know how they're really going to act yet.
And these are, of course, big generalizations.
Yes.
Naturally, so you have a whole lot of the general view here.
I embrace my Gen X, actually, and I do, because, we're the variable. I really do see in our generation peers of mine that went all in Boomer, and some that are very millennial in nature. We were the ones that saw that transition of those 1970s and 80s computers and know what goes on in the background more than a millennial does, but we're more comfortable with it than a Boomer is.
Right, yes, I remember now. I'm kind of, vague memories from the 80s. Everybody hated the hippies. But some of them, not in a bad way. I've stopped hating hippies. I thought when I was young and
Oh, got
Oh,
serious.
the baby
found
boomers
disco.
essentially for us were like the hippies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I was a little bit older, so my parents were more like beatniks, but still. But then maybe there was, I remember that split, right? There were those who went to the kind of punk, post-punk angle, that dark, kind of cynical, the world's going to hell,
Sure, the goth.
etc. That was before didn't exist yet. That's later, or maybe in America. Okay, we're going to talk about
Yeah, we were ahead of our time.
tribe designations, right? But then there were these kind of, we always thought of them a little bit of the Reagan kids, right? These kind of super, right? It was weird. They were kind of weird. They were in some sense kind of more punk than we were, I think, to wear their Dockers, and hush puppies and,
Thinking Family Ties.
You looked
TV
weird.
show.
At least where I was in Paris at the time, I guess, so maybe that doesn't count. But that looked really kind of out of place.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's curious that you mentioned that your folks were more like on the beatnik side. My folks were on the complete opposite, but they tell me that I'm beatnik.
How funny is that?
Yeah.
It's so retro. And,
Yeah.
Beatniks were, the hipsters before the hipsters were even born. No, more than that. I don't know. Beatnik had a lot of important things to say. I mean, they were kind of the precursors in many ways.
Right.
Right. I mean, so anyway, I really like this focus of how important the culture is. These kind of nebulous issues that we mainly recognize them at the individual level, but we so critically forgot what was bloody obvious to any thinking person, with or without education in humanity, until like I don't know, 100 years ago, that it extends to society. Right? And now you're telling us that people are really, even the baby boomer in power, are really getting finally that we have a problem here that will require serious change. I mean, I'm into that. I hope that you're right. It's hard to buy into.
They're just getting to the position where they can really do something about it. Is the idea there that when you look at the last 20 years of political leadership, corporate leadership, has really been the tail end. It's been the last of those silent generation people to retire off. Whereas when you look at the executives at Starbucks, Panera Bread's executive that went on a how do you eat? He tried to live for a couple weeks on just whatever the poverty level was. You have these executives that have founded companies or part of them that are starting to look at things differently. I know with conscious capitalism, we Live Nation that owns the 2 amphitheaters in the state of Florida. Their CEO decided to do an initiative where they would try to buy produce and supplies within 100 miles of the location and to buy organically because that's what their family at home was doing. John Mackey with Whole Foods. Organic food 7 years ago, we could have a conversation about GMOs and it would be a politically divisive conversation. Now you may question who's supposed to do something about it, but Costco is now the #1 seller of organic produce in the country, not Whole Foods. So obviously the market is craving better, more holistic answers to food. And I think, like I said, food is this thing that we're raising consciousness of quickly because we all eat 3 or 4 times or more a day. So it affects us quickly. But I think other things will start getting that. You know,
it's an enormous catastrophe too. Another thing.
Yeah,
The,
I mean,
the effects of our bad food on us
Yeah.
are estimated very significantly too.
And those are all places where, you know, investment by companies in education to raise the level of education of society allows society to make better long-term decisions, which means we're better long-term customers of Facebook if we're living longer. You want to boil it down.
Right. So that's,
if I'm not dying at a young age, I can contribute more data to the system. So even at a kind of...
I should be paid for that data. That is kind of my core thing here, right?
And
I should be paid for that data.
You know, if you think about it, you should be able to copyright it and get money for it.
Yeah.
Well, and that's if you become a producer, you can. There is a mechanism as a producer. There's no mechanism for the rest.
Right. And exactly, and that's very important because, sure, we're focusing on in places where there still is relative growth, there still are jobs, and it's sadly a minority, even a small minority. We're fortunate enough here, I guess, all around the table to have access to enjoy these things, but of course a lot of people don't. So, you know, how do you extend it? What many feminists criticize precisely because you mentioned it, right, Sheryl Sandberg, because of her leaning in, which is a decision to make, perhaps, be assertive upper class white woman.
Yeah.
Which is very important. Yes, please be assertive upper class. I go further than Sheryl Sandberg. I think you should start smacking more often, first of all, right? So don't get me wrong on that one, but I also very much feel the pain of the vast majority of women around the world who, you know, their problem is not getting raped.
They don't
on a
have
regular
that
basis.
access.
Right. And there are a lot of things like that. Gay marriage, right? That rare occasion where the economic incentives and the right thing came together. Something that you're actually looking to happen more often, I'm hoping.
So, you know, when you look at that, you look at, you know, take Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and the things they're trying to do. You know, what the negative sides of what collecting data and owning data is. But when you look at what they're trying to do with connecting people, and the argument is long term you'll create a better society. So, you know, how does Sheryl Sandberg help with facilitating this?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I look at, you know, a target person for this theory to really look at it, take ownership of it, and help facilitate it, Sheryl Sandberg's an ideal candidate because she is trying to, how does she improve the opportunities for women that are not in her privileged standpoint?
Right.
And this is a way to do it because you could actually look at and observe the quality of people's lives after they've been invested in. And the idea being is those people would then provide returns to society, which then come back to the company. And
but it comes back to everybody. I mean, right? Our model is that she only wants, I mean, I'm just picking her, right?
No,
she only wants return to her, essentially, right? So one of the problems, leadership doesn't care about our failing education system in America, right? Because all their kids are in private school. Why would they care? Back in the good old days, again, you know, of capitalism, even the factory owners, the capitalist kids, were in public school, or they created them for them if they didn't exist.
Well, see, I think a lot of it, they don't know what, they don't, you know, I think we give a lot of our founders a lot more credit than expect. You know, I watched Elon Musk talk about the Hyperloop between LA and San Francisco, and he wasn't sure what governmental agency ran the interstate that he would need to get the right-of-way from. You know, they've been brilliant in one place, but not so much in others. And again, you know, Mark, I think, made a brilliant hire by bringing on Sheryl Sandberg, but it doesn't mean he knows about education. That's why, you know, he lost $100 million in the New Jersey school system because, well, if I give them money because they're saying they have no money, it'll solve the problem. Bill Gates discovered the same thing. You can't throw money at it, which is why then you get Peter Thiel with the Thiel Scholarship. Hey, I'll give you $100 grand to drop out of college.
So sadly,
that's not an answer either.
No, it's a terrible answer.
For a brilliant person that's got an idea, that'll work, but it's not the...
No, then who will develop your roads? I mean, how are you going to ship your goods, buddy, if they don't have a road system?
But that's things, they don't understand these other things that influence the society, and I think that's where you're learning. When you look at Zuckerberg's contribution last year, $400 billion or whatever it was, he got slack from the philanthropic industrial complex because he put that money in an LLC instead of a foundation. Because Zuckerberg realizes. As an LLC, I can invest in social enterprise. If I just do it in a foundation, it gets sucked into the philanthropic model, and there's no way to get it out again. So I think that's a learning curve that was different. Whereas if you look at Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, they're still philanthropic for everything. Whereas Facebook's idea is we want to be more nimble with what we can do with our capital.
And I must say, I haven't been following this. I've been a bit cynical about it, and got to develop all these avant-garde educational models who has time. No, I love it, by the way. First of all, let me go. First of all, really thank you.
Thank you.
This is one of the most cheeriest afternoon. This is the most cheery afternoon I've had, other than playing video games. I think in a long time, in a very long time. So that's great. That's really useful for me personally. Here's a little bit of a. I see this, Bill Gates actually, and the foundation and everything, used to be almost my token conservatives, almost. I say it like that, right? I mean, in the sense of, here's a smart conservative. Here's somebody who's thinking straight. Kind of the token, if you will. But now his foundation, especially when it comes to education, is all bad. There's nothing good to say about it. So they've really fallen into, I like the way of, they completely... By thinking they know better, by perhaps not appreciating that this is a complex issue, by following the trends, perhaps, of school reform, so-called, they ended up, with all the good meaning, doing bad things, involved in bad reforms, racket kind of reforms. Then there's the more, you said about giving money to schools. So let's play with this idea. One of the problems we see today is that when wealthy people, who are the people who can give donations, by definition, are giving donations to schools. They give it to highly endowed schools that don't know what to do with that money anymore, especially since they don't pay taxes, which is another story, right? When schools like John Hopkins in the middle of one of the biggest ghettos in the Western world, they don't even pay taxes for firefighters. Firefighters have to go through the fire zone of the ghetto to put fire out to John Hopkins, but they don't pay taxes for it. So that's another story. But they don't need any money. We're talking schools about hundreds of billions, I mean, the big ones, right? Why does another millionaire give another 100 million to Harvard? What are they going to do with it?
Well, I think the mass scale of it, first of all, this fellowship investment idea probably wouldn't go to those schools. Or if you go to any school that a company would want to do. The idea being, though, is just the mass influx of this kind of money would disrupt the education system. Number one, I don't think it would go to public universities first because, like the lessons learned by the Gates Foundation, you can't just throw money at a public school. There's too much of a bureaucracy. It gets lost and absorbed in that bureaucracy.
But wait, big publics are, I mean, that's where, all the weapons, like you mentioned Stanford, I mean, who invents all the fancy missiles?
No, what I mean is public schools as in, like, if you look at University of South Florida compared to Rollins College or University of Tampa. That it wouldn't be. I'm not talking about your Stanford, Harvard, on that private. Those are huge. Yeah. And I'm also not talking about.
But UCF is going there. Clearly, their model is we're going to be that big.
I'm not familiar with UCF's
are.
structure here.
They're going for this kind of big money. Yeah.
But the idea, though, is you've got these two areas: these well-endowed private universities and these public universities that are kind of catch-alls. But for the business model to work, you've got to look at your middle-level private nonprofit universities, again, like a Rollins, Elon, UT, those schools.
And undergraduate workforce.
Undergraduate, because right now there is funding for fellowships at a graduate level, but there's scholarships for undergraduate.
Nothing like it used to be. I got students today, and the deal they get from UNC is nothing like the deal I got from them.
And because it became more about a return on investment. As opposed to a circulation of currency. And that's, again, that mindset that this is an investment, but it's a method of circulating currency. If you look at Victor Lebeau in the 1950s, television was spreading across the United States. Lebeau believed that if companies invested in television advertising, they would indoctrinate the American population to become consumers that would grow a larger consumer market and sell products. It was a circulation of currency. Companies didn't do that prior to the 50s. It was something that was taught to them by a theorist. What I'm looking at here is the same thing. Is companies have idle cash reserves that are sitting idle doing nothing. We have all of these problems. we have all this data that is valuable that's not being cultivated. So what if, like brands in the 50s with advertising, what if companies in this century started investing in education, create a better educated population that would grow the market and availability of better user-generated content to a better society as a whole, that would grow the economic pie for everybody in a more sustainable way. Because LeBeau's efforts with advertising was, we ended up with a consumer market that throws things away because you got to burn through things. Whereas this model that I'm proposing is you circulate currency into human capital, people as a society to invest in themselves. There's no limit to how much you can learn that way, and therefore you're going to still reinvest your own human capital in more user-generated content because you're participating in that system.
Yeah, I can see there's certainly several interesting better incentives, like entrapment into student debt, things like that. Absolutely. Almost like, and the idea is that you can, you're thinking that you could launch this a little bit without the necessity for political, economic change, essentially. The politics will follow.
Yeah. What, Yahoo was bought for $3 billion a couple weeks ago? Or by Verizon?
Again, are they?
I think something like that.
Oh,
Well, you live there. Say, I think Facebook bought WhatsApp for $1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
My proposal is 1% of the tech sector's cash reserves in 2013. 2013 were $690 billion. 1% of those cash reserves would be $6.9 billion. Roughly a little bit more than double the amount that was offered for Yahoo. That amount of money at $20,000 per student for tuition, that's the average across the nation, and $30,000 living stipend, would take 138,000 fellowships out of the job market and into college, debt-free. If the tech sector were to do that between now and the election, a lot of the election might not be the same relevance as it is now, because it would be the 138,000 people in school without debt, based on 1% being repatriated tax-free by the technology sector. And that's, again, why the future, this is the theory right now, is my next steps that I'm working on is researching what are the numbers, how does that start falling out if 1% happened this year and it grew over the next 5 to 10.
Well, actually, look, I have an idea, because Corey's listening to us. Well, hey, Corey. He's the one who keyed me in on many of these issues. He's interested in the energy sector, so that's his specialty. And of course, I am kind of throwing out there that you're focusing on the tech sector, and it's interesting. Perhaps maybe I get the feeling that you think that that's a place where it could actually more easily perhaps happen. Of course, how about the rest will be another question. What he's pointing out, and that's also relative to this, that cash corporations hold right now isn't very large when compared to their debts. Their idle cash offsets debt that's taken on to return capital to shareholders while avoiding taxes. So talk about the numbers might be, of course, this is probably a general number. So he's not looking at tech industry might have a bit of a different.
Well, I don't know about all the numbers on it. So I know I have an example in my book about Walmart. They're like, well, if we did a tax holiday, companies would repatriate money. The difference is, Walmart, when they needed, I think it was $500 million. It was a large sum of money that they needed for liquidity. Rather than repatriating money and taking the tax hit, they borrowed it from a bank and paid the interest because it was cheaper. So access to capital is not a challenge to companies right now. Like, there's access to capital. One of the other examples is a company that did repatriate is, I believe, did eBay sell PayPal or the other way around? But one of them, they repatriated money, took the tax hit, and then became acquired.
I think it was eBay.
It was eBay repatriated $9 billion, took a tax hit on it, and then did they sell off? No,
I think they sold it off.
I think they sold off PayPal.
Yeah,
that's what it was. Maybe wrong on it, but it was some configuration of that. But so the idea is access to capital is definitely there. Cash reserves, actually, so when you look at that $690 billion in the tech sector, it's only about 13% of annual revenues, which historically is not bad. And the argument I make is, if we were in the 1950s or if we were in the 1930s when these accounting principles were created, keeping 10% of annual revenue in reserves is a smart idea because we're using fax machines, postal service, and a lot slower access to data. What I'm arguing is Amazon or Facebook actually damaging their position in the market by retaining too much cash? And they're retaining too much cash, again, this goes back to because they hired a CFO, and the mindset of the financial sector is to keep 10%. Not because you have to, but because that's what we've always done. And we all know accountants and finance people don't like to change very often.
And the incentive schemes are such that it makes sense
keeping
to
it the same way.
put it all over the world and not right.
Yeah.
Actually, Corey does confirm the suspicions that the tech industry is cash rich, but most of corporate America, net of debt, is not. But maybe all the more reason that this could be a place to push for this.
Well, and that's why, because it's based on user-generated content.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Amazon, without the Amazon reviews, would be a worthless company.
Yeah, right.
Like, it wouldn't be the company it is.
Right.
But what are they doing to cultivate better reviews?
Well, they're giving you little bones here and there.
Well, there's little bones here and there, but
Yeah.
so there's some incentivization. But
Yeah.
again, they can't do much because it'll ruin the review.
No, and there's a degree of
But-
just sharing the information. You feel, there
Yes,
are these
you
feelings,
want to
right?
do it.
Goodwill.
So the idea is,
let's
if
call it.
Amazon decided, you know what, our user-generated content, these reviews are worth X billion dollars, we're going to invest a percentage of that in education because it's obvious people with better educations are leaving better, more rounded reviews that are better to the customers.
Right.
That's that long tail cycle of where the return on investment is.
Though, I can't help. I mean, again, just to mess around with things. I've been really one of the first clients of Amazon, I think. Really, because it was really like a...
They have a portrait of you.
I'm ahead of my time. No, I'm not rich enough, to have a portrait. But in terms of how many purchases and like from the day they opened, more or less. So, and I love it. And I got, an egg in the house, and I got, everything. But it bugs me because they are evil. I mean, I love it, I love it, don't get me wrong, but I can't, just because I love it, I'm not going to isolate myself from the facts.
Yeah.
They treat, recently we found out that the internal, also this kind of sell your soul to the corporation, you have no private life, which is, by the way, not only nasty and inhuman, but is an explicitly sexist way of looking at things because that disadvantages women tremendously. By being told that if you care for somebody else, you will be penalized. I mean, that's when corporations look psychopathic, and it seems like Amazon follows that lead shockingly. In the tech industry, it's supposed to be different.
Yeah.
The most shocking even than all is when in the Christmas season, right, they hire all these extra workers, and they have them searched, like serious searched, entry and exit, on their time. So why did the employer, like Amazon, have them pay 20 minutes, be basically searched on their time? They're not getting paid.
Yeah.
And 20 minutes or 40 minutes of their wage labor is being stolen by Amazon. Why? Well, the answer is the age-old answer in economics.
Yeah.
Because they can.
Yeah.
That's models that have been used in different industries too. The
Yeah.
airline industry does that
Of
too.
course.
They put you on call. You have to make all these calls before you even get to the airplane, and until they don't close the door, you're not getting paid.
Yeah.
So that's been going on for quite some time.
Right, again, it's a human nature in some sense, and hence this issue of who stops that. So if the workers have a say in decision-making about the company, then they'll stop it because they won't do it to themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the key arguments, right, behind worker-managed companies. You could think of regulation, but of course we know that even now we have the regulation, but it just doesn't have any teeth anymore.
Well,
Amazon's
Or it's inefficient.
I don't know if you've heard of this corporation. It's called the Mondragon.
Yeah.
And they're from Spain, right?
Right, it's a huge now.
Yeah,
huge
and
operation.
it's employee-owned.
Yeah.
And they're sustainable, and they make
In
money,
America,
and
there are plenty of those,
Yeah.
by the way. It's like people don't sadly talk about it enough.
Yeah.
And they're very actually successful. Again,
Publix here in Florida.
but then, as you mentioned, because I was doing some research.
Yeah, they have their own challenges.
Right. And they're not managed, by the way. I like to point out that this is a very different, there's a bit of a, it's perhaps not a bad thing, but just paying shares to workers
Is
is
not the same as
nothing
managed.
like managed, right? Here we're talking about making the decision.
Yeah.
Have to envision that thing. Think out there. I mean, how many people out there? I'm sure a huge majority, and many of them write. Couldn't you manage the company you work for better?
You could.
You know, or couldn't you get together with everybody and kind of solve the problems if you didn't? Maybe, right? Because
I think you've got, with the tech sector, Jeff Bezos is more of a Steve Jobs mindset when it comes to employees, it seems, disruptive in the technology side, but again, and Apple and Amazon are very employee labor heavy, and there's a lot of holdover from that old economic thinking, whereas if you look at Google and Facebook, they don't have the same low-level employees that an Amazon does. So I think that's there's differences in personalities, and I think Bezos could do a better job, although he may be living in a world that he just realizes in 5 years I'm not going to need any employees. So what does it matter how I treat them now? Yeah, it's
Right.
the idea at some point is those employees go away.
And that is very well possible. I mean, people get into those mindsets. I mean, you have Blockbuster Video, who completely refuse to move on with the times and go digital. And where are they now?
right.
And I think that's going to be a disruptive fact. The idea that if Google and Facebook were to invest billions in education and remove hundreds of thousands of people from the job market, would that impact the amount that Amazon needs to pay its workers? Because now there's less of a pool. The idea is right now is if we're talking about this old school miracle that new jobs are going to be created without redefining what a job is, then we have a problem.
Well,
but if we redefine what a job is, or what value creation is,
Yes.
there's a whole bunch of other dominoes that fall.
And like several things we mentioned, it's not about choosing to do so. It's about being caught completely with the pants off and collapse, economically speaking, at least for a while, or being able to adapt. And adaptation is the one rule of science, right? I mean, those who adapt better do better. Right?
Yes.
That's the one closest to universal truth we have. I mean, I like, before we have so much fun, we're running out of time. One of the things that I find interesting, the whole STEM rhetoric, I call it BS on that, because I was trying to be polite more than a little. It's a supply side argument. It's like so silly to hear it still today. The notion that if we generate good engineers, there will be good engineering jobs in America. This is like, and they will all be involved riding unicorns, these jobs.
Yes.
I mean, but again, this is the kind of stuff you hear from like Ivy League PhDs with a straight face. I mean, either are they idiots, literally? Maybe there's idiot savants. People who can do one thing remarkably well, but have absolutely no idea about anything else. I mean, I'm not trying to be, idiot savants are remarkable people, in what they do.
It's myopic and siloed. I get with what I'm writing. People, the first question is, are you an economics major? And I was like, I probably wouldn't have come up with the idea if I was.
Most of the economic majors, not here, that's why I'm here, by the way, that's why I came here. Most economic majors are little more than low-level indoctrination.
Yeah, and well, and the idea, this downplay of economics as being a science, or this upplaying of economics as a science and not a subset of philosophy. And that's that same mindset that goes into STEM. If we do this, it's going to result in a certain result. And I think that return to the humanities and liberal arts is extremely important, because all of what I've produced has not been created because of a specific education mindset. It's been because my education has allowed me to liberally explore what I want to explore.
Right, and that's indeed what we know. And if you look at the upper echelons, even if you look at the average pay in first 10 years and stuff like that, you find that you'd be surprised, right? That many things that are considered to be, the most practical, this will get you a job, not really.
Yeah.
Actually, I like this element in this cycle of sending the money through the schooling system, in that perhaps this would be very difficult to do anymore. If it's Facebook that's channeling the money into whatever school program here, it seems silly that they will say, let's train new software engineers that we're not intending on hiring.
No, and that's the thing, is if you're going to school for something that's employable right now, you can get a fund for that, or you can pay off those loans. How do we fund college that's not necessarily paid off by a job? And what new things come out of that? When all of a sudden, if we put a generation of students through college that have no student loan debt and are able to study whatever they want.
Yeah.
My money's on that, creating something big,
Right.
as opposed to just creating engineers.
Right, because the whole notion, despite living in the sectors that cry free market the loudest, right? This whole like, oh, the practicality, you know, and all that.
Yeah.
No, it's not. First of all, it doesn't. The facts seem to definitely not confirm that. We're not sure what we're training to, but the value is actually there. It might not be. It seems to suggest the value is there. It's just difficult to quantify, first of
Yes.
all, right? So and it's got to do with what you were talking about, this fake scientificity, some people go, fake scientism, that economics tries to, in places where it can't, to do. So some things are kind of a little bit gut, a little bit like, well, why is it better to have people who are rounded, familiar with our culture and our history? We can come up with pragmatic argument, and we can also come up with these kind of vague ones that, well, they're more interesting to talk to. Now, but that's just nothing, right? That's just BS. That's not really important in economics. Hell, yes, it is.
It is.
A third of the economy is persuasion. So talking well is not important.
Absolutely.
Right, so all of those things, so hence it's interesting to think of a rather pragmatic, in fact very market-oriented proposal that is embracing what Corey's final text to me is, quoting that beautiful quote from Einstein, right, that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts.
Absolutely.
So it might require, so these cultural changes are interesting. I would definitely personally applaud it as shaking the boat in any way. Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Thanks.
Always, you know, and there's interesting potential synergies. Just rolling it around a little bit, seeing if somebody does come with a good model that works, and certainly there will be a lot of unintended consequences.
You know, one thing before we end the show, definitely. If you can tell people, you have the website
Yeah.
or something?
Yeah, give us the verbal stuff, and don't forget to send me all the, I mean, you send me some stuff, but you know, what you want.
Yeah. My website is vinnytafiro.com, or you can also go to laborcage.com.
Labor Cage.
And,
It's a good name, by the way, too.
Thank
I like
you,
that whole,
thank you.
Yeah.
The book is called Unlocking the Labor Cage. It's actually a nod to Keynes when he said to get off the gold standard, he called it the gold cage. And I'm saying at this point we're in a labor cage, and we need to look at labor differently in the future.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, yeah, we should try and get together again. You know, get other people in. You know, to talk. I mean, there's like Jose needs to come and maybe like have some argument on third world and global poverty and how that could fit. It's great to have such a big idea. It's an era where we need big ideas.
And a positive one for change.
Yeah.
It's got to be positive.
Well,
It's too much negative. I just can't do it.
It's hard. Good for you. You know, it's hard. I know. It's going to have conscious effort sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's necessary, because otherwise we either get depressed or we become fascists of one flavor or another.
And you're working on the second one?
This
We're
is
done,
my
right?
second book.
Yeah.
So it's available. Unlocking the
Okay.
Labor Cage. It's available on Amazon. I'm doing a book launch in Tampa next Wednesday,
Cool.
and then in New York and Boston the following week, and then coming back to Florida, and going wherever I can with it. So
Excellent. No, come again with it, because there's
Thank
so
you.
much to deal with this, and you know, absolutely. You know, I mean, let's and yeah, we'll put it. Of course, I already did like a quick
Appreciate it.
post, but we'll do more, because this is really. It's funny how this kind of came together. Since this whole issue, it's a big issue. You know, if we have an economy based on people, you know, welfare is based on how desperate they are.
Yeah.
And they're desperate for work, and if there's no work, we have to think of different ways of paying people than
yes,
selling their labor. Right? Brilliant.
So,
Thank
yeah.
you.
We probably
Definitely.
stop here, otherwise we'll open a whole new topic.
Yeah, definitely.
There's
Well,
so much,
actually,
there's a lot in there.
There's a lot of stuff that we can
Yeah.
open up.
That's what I mean by big idea. I didn't mean it like it's a compliment, I meant it's a technical term.
yes.
And a compliment. But you know what I'm saying?
It's been a pleasure.
It's
Thank
a
you.
thick, like in philosophy they call it a thick, right?
Yes.
It's thick. Multi-layered.
All right, so
Excellent.
you've been listening to Punkonomics, broadcasting live from WPRK, Winter Park, Florida, the voice of Rollins College, and the best of basement radio. And we'd like to remind you that all the comments stated here today are solely ours, not of the staff of WPRK all the lovely people at Rollins Knowledge.
Blending it in. Yeah, it's going outside too. Thanks. No, really. I mean,
Thank
there's a
you.
lot of things. I almost, you know, I mean, I'll put it definitely. Buy a couple of those for the department too to be on hand.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
What size shirts do you guys wear?
Well, I'm
X large.
XXL at this point.
I've got
XL to
two
XXL.
XLs.
Yeah, I should, and I'm trying to lose. No, it's a very clever. We have more than. Yeah. Yeah, too. I mean, right? I see. You know, I want to because I think it's so important also to communicate with general public. I mean, sure, I can see this. This could be. I can see sessions, the kind of sessions I go in conferences. We talk about stuff like that in small rooms in the back.
Yeah.
So I totally see that.
Sayonara.
Oh yeah.
Take care. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.